Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for letting the other witnesses go first.
Sure.
My name is Dick Levine. I filled out the electronic form as Richard. I'm going to have to figure out how to go back and change that. I am Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Center for Public Policy Priorities here in Austin, and I'm here to testify against House Bill 800. And I've had some discussions, Mr. Chairman, with you, and I have not seen the committee sub, and I understand there'll be further changes made, and I'd like to suggest some of those changes that I believe would make this a better piece of legislation before I get to the final question, which is, of course, whether this legislation is needed at all. I'll wait 1 second for the materials to be distributed. I think I've been able to distribute all these in advance to each one of your offices and to talk personally to several of you about this. What I will be testifying on is excerpts from a very good report done by the Legislative Budget Board that came out at the end of January called Overview of Research and Development Tax Incentives. I want to be very clear that the LBB, on their cover letter, they were very clear that they are making no recommendations concerning R&D tax incentives one way or the other. But there's and I have more copies of this 30-page report if you need it. But what I'll be testifying off is excerpts that I've taken from the report, and I've indicated which page from the report that I am quoting from. If you'd like a copy later or want to get it yourself online. The first question is on the reporting. This is just generally good public policy and good tax policy is that you need reports on whether or not this incentive is accomplishing what you want it to accomplish. You have heard testimony already about it'll increase investment, it'll increase jobs, jobs with good wages, but you need somebody to report back to you or through the controller whether or not this is actually accomplished. Now, under the old R&D tax credit, under the former franchise tax, the controller was required. Actually, you have it with a cover sheet that says, I think, SB 441. That you can see this is a report that was required under the old R&D tax credit. There's nothing, at least at the moment, in House Bill 800 to require anything like this. And you can see, and I think I've highlighted some of the important things down in the bottom right-hand column of the first page about the total amount of credits applied against the franchise tax is a little over $100 million, and the unused credits were $350 million. That's useful information because that $350 million will appear later as credits against the franchise tax or a reduction in revenue in the future. That is the kind of information you will need now, you will need in order to make future decisions about R&D. Also, the very last paragraph, incidentally, points out that corporations with fewer than 100 employees accounted for only a little more than 12% of the credits. In other words, this is not for startup firms. This is going to be used, I believe, primarily by well-established companies. In fact, under the way the credit is structured now, you get a 5% credit or maybe a little extra compared to 50% of your prior 3 years. In other words, if you said, if you were spending, say, $1 million a year for each of 3 years, and in the fourth year, this credit becomes available, and you're spending another $1 million, you're going to get a credit anyway. You haven't increased R&D expenditures. You're keeping your expenditures flat at $1 million a year, but under the formula in the bill, you'd still get a 2.5% credit because you're comparing your current $1 million against 50% of your average of the past 3 years against $500,000. So this incentive comes to you for just doing what you were doing already, not for increasing what we are trying to incentivize. This is the kind of information you can get with a report. Also, on this page in Table 5, it shows you by sector where the credits were being taken. And most of it's what you'd expect, manufacturing, electronics, business services. But you might also note that there's some credits, 5 corporations claim credits who do their business in retail trade food stores. And another 22 claimed credit for retail trade, home furniture, and furnishings. Now, you would not know this kind of information if you did not require the controller to give you this information, and based on that, you might want to change the credit that's being proposed in this bill to focus on the industries that you're most interested in, and maybe not retail food and retail home furnishings. And then lastly, and I think this will be important to several of you, it shows in Table 6 the geographic distribution. And overwhelmingly, the old credit at least was taken by companies in Dallas County and Travis County. In fact, those two counties accounted for more than 60% of the total credits taken. Again, I'm not judging one way or the other. That may be where the industry is located, but you need that information in order to make the right judgment now. And whoever's here 3 years or 4 years from now may want to come back and look at that. But you need the reporting. And the last thing that's mentioned in the summary by the LBB is that the unavailability of individual company-level data made it difficult, it says, precludes a robust statistical and economic analysis. And this is not asking too much. I gave you just as an example, there are several states that do this, but this is North Carolina. And I just gave you, you can see it's just not even all of the A's, but they tell you by company who is getting which of the many tax credits that's available in North Carolina. Again, the kind of information that you need in order to make the best decisions in the future. Let me go on to the next page about sunset date. Now, as you know, there are bills to sunset all the tax breaks in the tax code, and I think there's a constitutional amendment actually that has been filed in the House that would sunset all existing tax breaks after 10 years and require any future tax incentives have a 10-year sunset. This is, again, just good general public policy. Even if you got all the reporting that I'm suggesting would be useful to you, unless there's something that makes you come back and take a look, it's just information, it's just data. But data is not good unless it requires action. So if this bill were to have a sunset date, 6 years, 8 years, whatever you think is appropriate, that would force you to come back, look at the data that's been collected, look at the companies and the nature of the companies that have taken the credit, and force you or whoever's here in 6 years or whenever to decide whether this bill is getting done, what you want is getting done, and is it doing it in the most efficient and most effective manner. The federal credit has a sunset date, and as I said, under the old franchise tax, there was a sunset date, although because of the changes made in 2006, it didn't really get to it. Next, there should be a time limit on claiming the credits. And the reason for this is on this next piece of paper. This is from the report just came out from the controller, in which he reports on all tax exemptions and tax expenditures, as they're called, and their cost to the state. What I've highlighted down the bottom there is credits carried forward from prior credit provisions, and there's a short paragraph on the next page that explains that that's primarily R&D tax credits that were earned under the old code that was abolished in 2006. But you can see, according to the controller, in 2013, there's still $22.6 million in credits being taken, another 17.1 in 2014. That is $40 million in credits being taken out of the current budget or the future part of the future budget for a bill that was repealed in 2006. So you have to be very aware of the long, long time period. And at the moment, it's an infinite time period. And I would suggest 10 years or something like that would be a much more conservative approach to budgeting, not committing future legislatures to honoring credits that are being taken for research that's done decades in the past. Another way that you can keep some control over the drain of state revenue is to have a statewide cap, and the LBB reports that there are 7 states that have a cap, and there are other tax incentives that we have had in the past in Texas where there is a cap. What would happen is all the companies would apply for their credits. You would see whether they exceeded the cap, and if so, you would just apportion the credits for each company by whatever percentage would keep the total drain on the state treasury below that predetermined number, and they could roll those tax credits over into the future, but at least you would have some control over how much was being taken out of the revenue in each and every biennium. And then the last question, of course, is this really the best way to go about what you want to do? What you want to do is incentivize research and development, hopefully commercialization, and the creation of a lot of good jobs here. But as you can read here, there's many things besides tax credits and tax incentives that determine whether companies locate. And as the LBB mentions, the skill of workforce and infrastructure are among those factors, and those require investment now. And that investment requires money. And as the prior speaker said, the cost of this bill is total $455 million out of the next budget. Better use, perhaps, of that $455 million would be investments in increasing workforce skills and infrastructure. In fact, the state of Washington has a sunset process for its tax code. This is Washington, where Microsoft is located, where Amazon is located. But this document here from their advisory committee, I will just read from the very bottom. Well, first it says that the commission recommends that the legislature allow their tax credit and their sales and tax use, they have a deferral or waiver, to expire in 2015 as scheduled, which means, for one, they had a sunset date and they had a review commission, and the commission recommended letting their credits expire, and the last paragraph explains why. Because the legislature's objective to create quality employment opportunities in the state, which I assume is one of your objectives, might be achieved more cost-effectively in other ways, such as partnering with the high-tech R&D industry to provide educational and training programs that develop human resources skills needed by the industry. So even if you were starting with a desire to increase R&D and increase the spending in the state, you may need to go back and take a look as whether tax incentives is the best way to do it, or whether the change that has been made in the committee sub, encouraging private investment through our institutions of higher education, might be the way to do it without a much broader tax credit. And obviously that would be a much more economical way to go about it. And the last thing, the second paragraph in this section under better uses of state funds, and this is quoting from the LBB study, the state's national ranking in both total R&D spending and R&D intensity has remained relatively constant over the last 2 decades, both before, during, and after the time frame the credit was available in Texas. So in other words, the past credit may not have accomplished what you want to accomplish at all. So I suggest that you go back and rethink this starting from the beginning. What are you trying to accomplish? And then what is the best way to accomplish it? And I suggest HB 800 is probably not the best way.